The 5-act story structure. If I were to pick out one of these different story structures, whether it's 3-act, 5-act, 7-point, I think that I would say the 5-act story structure is my favorite one. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. In the past, I've talked about how the Greeks viewed stories. Now, one of those old philosophers, I believe it might have been Aristotle, but it could have very well been Plato, said a story consists of a beginning, middle, and an end. So that's the most basic idea of what a story is. And you can check out my episode on a story having a beginning and middle and end here if you're watching this, or you can check it out in the description below if you're listening to this on audio. But there are different ways to look at story. All of them do have a beginning, middle, and end, but they label the different parts of a story differently than one another and break it apart in different ways. As I said before, there's a 5-act structure and there is a 3-act structure as well. The 5-act structure is the one you see most often in plays, or at least I believe you see it most often in plays. And one of the reasons you see it a lot in plays is because some of the biggest plays that exist are Shakespearean plays. I think it's an understatement to say that they're some of the biggest. They are the biggest. And Shakespeare uses the 5-act structure in his plays. The first act is called the Exposition. This is what I like to call the old normal or the old stasis within a story. In the first act, or the Exposition, the writer is establishing the setting. Where is the story taking place? When is the story taking place? And depending on who the writer is, this is going to have a lot of variation. Some of my favorite settings are barely any setting at all. It doesn't really tell you about where the story is taking place, but it gives maybe one detail. For example, I once saw a play about Don Quixote, which was set in a prison where Cervantes was telling the story of Don Quixote with the other prisoners. But they had very few props in that play, and they needed to tell that whole entire play using only props that were set in the prison. It was very cool to see. Other settings have tons of different details that are explained by the author. This is often the case in epic fantasy. And one of the reasons this happens in epic fantasy is because they are in a different world. They need to show how that world is different than our own. And they often need to establish such things as customs and history. Within the exposition, you are also introducing the main character. The final major piece is the conflict that is introduced in the story. And this conflict can take place in the inciting incident, one very distinct thing, or it can actually be woven into the setting itself. If you've ever seen Vonnegut's different shapes of stories, you might know about his shape called the man in the hole. When you are presented with a man in the whole story, which means that the character is starting out in a very bad situation, the conflict is introduced almost immediately, and it's woven into the setting to show that the setting isn't very good. So the setting necessitates that the character move out of that setting and fix something in the world. Now, some people say that the conflict is the most important part of the exposition. Some people say that the inciting incident or the introduction of the conflict is, And I think this is incorrect. I think that you have to have all of these present, and I think you have to have all these present in good ways, in correct ways, in appropriate ways to actually move forward in the story in a way that makes sense to the reader. In some cases, you are barely going to have a setting explained. In some cases, you're barely going to explain who the main character is, or maybe you won't even explain the main character at all in that initial exposition. And in some cases, you're going to only be hinting at the conflict that will be happening later in the story. So I don't think one of these is more important than the other. I think you should take time to do your best in each of these areas and weave them together in a way that makes logical sense. Act 2 is called the rising action. Once that inciting incident happens, once we are introduced to the conflict, the tension starts in the story. And the rising action takes on this tension, and it continues to build the tension. The tension rises. The conflict that is introduced in the first act has more complications, or there's more conflicts introduced. And in most cases, I think this is the time when the question in the reader's mind really becomes clear. The conflict becomes evident. They know what is happening in the story, or at least they think they know what is happening in the story. And they're asking themselves, is this conflict going to go this way, or is this conflict going to go another way? Now, when you deal with mysteries, this is a little different because there is a shroud pulled over the conflict for the reader. So the reader doesn't know what is going to happen, but there's still a very distinct question in the reader's mind. Another thing to note about Act 2 is that in this act, the tension keeps on building and building and building. And we don't get to the point of answering what the question is in the reader's mind, but more conflicts come in, more issues arrive for the main character, and the tension builds to a point where the reader's like, I need to know what is going to happen. And that brings us to the next act. The third act is the climax, and this is the act where everything comes to a head. Some might call this the turning point. One thing to mention is that this is the point in the story where the tension has become the greatest. This is the point in the story where we are a hair's breadth away from the main character failing or succeeding, and we don't know what's going to happen. And this is the part of the story that usually puts the reader, if it's done well, on the edge of his seat. And this is also the part of the story where I believe the tension breaks. I believe the main character either succeeds or fails, and once the main character succeeds or fails, and we know the answer to the question created by the tension. Now, some people might disagree that we should put the answer in the climax of the story, but I think this is wrong. I think that it's incorrect to put it into the next section. I think that it belongs in the climax of the story because it makes sense to lump it together. We don't usually break apart the story right before we have that answer. We usually have a story that keeps on ramping up and ramping up and ramping up, and the story doesn't have a story break right before we find the answer. It's actually the case that the greatest tension and the answer to that tension are wed together in one single scene. You don't write a fantasy story and have a sword fight and cut the sword fight off just before we find out whether the main character wins or not. It's usually the case that you have the sword fight, and at the end of the chapter, we see the main character winning the sword fight against the antagonist or losing it against the antagonist. And then at the very end of that chapter, we think to ourselves, what is going to happen because the main character succeeded? Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, we still have a question in our mind. We don't know what happens because of that, so why would you put the climax right there? We have a different question in our mind now. We don't have the same question we've been asking the entire story. During the entire story, we were asking ourselves, is the hero going to win? And now that the hero is going to win, we can relax and we still anticipate what is going to happen and what is going to result from the hero winning. But we don't need to ask that question anymore. The question has been answered for us. So this is why I actually lump that point in the story in the climax. I think it's appropriate in that position. I mention this here because if you look up the 5-act structure, you may find people who disagree with me. So we get to this point where the question we've been asking the whole story has been answered. And once that question is answered, we feel either a wash of relief or we think, oh no, like the main character has failed and what is going to happen since the main character failed, or the person has plunged themselves into disaster. And once this first question has been answered, we get to the 4th act of the play called the falling action. As I said before, the tension has been broken. Once we enter Act 4, the reader is probably feeling calmer, more relaxed. And in some cases, writers use this to present a false victory or a false defeat. A false defeat is where the question's already answered for us. And then we see the main character about to claim victory, and the antagonist sweeps in and tries something again. I don't like this practice. I am not going to explain why I dislike it here. You can certainly add it into your story, and I'm sure there's ways to do it in great ways, but I just rarely ever see it done in a way that's satisfying. Besides a false victory in this part of the story, other plot points are tied up. If you have multiple different stories going on within your story, then this is the point of the story where you show whether those subplots result in victory or defeat for the protagonist. But once those subplots are tied up, then you're getting to Act 5, which is called the denouement. I like to call this the new normal or the new stasis. If you listen to my episode on the 3 different parts of a story, you know I have the old stasis and you know I have the new stasis. This is the point in the story where you show how things have changed because of what happened in the story. Now, during the falling action, I said that you're finishing plot points or you're finishing plot arcs for other characters or other portions of the story. In this part of the story, you're actually tying up loose ends. You're showing where characters end up. If you've ever seen The Sandlot, they do a denouement or they do Act 5 in a way that is very evident in the story. Now, The Sandlot has a narrator, so sometimes the narrator pipes in, and at the end of the movie, what happens is they show every character during that movie, and the narrator explains what happened to each of those characters. For example, Squints, the kid at the pool, ends up marrying the lifeguard and having like 6 or 7 different kids. The final thing I'd like to mention with the 5-act structure is that some people will tell you you absolutely should use it. And with any type of writing, you should use what works best for you. For me, I like to keep it pretty simple in terms of how I plot my books out. I don't like to stick to a really strict format such as the 5-act structure because I find that my books don't flow as well and I'm trying to meet certain story beats instead of finding what comes naturally to me. Now, it might be the case that I end up with a 5-point structure at the end, but I arrive at it in a more organic way. And it's just a better system for me to use. I think it's really important to understand how this structure works because when you are editing or you're revising, you're trying to make your story work well, this can actually be a tool you can use and you can think, is my story flowing well? Is it matching these different points? Because even if you've read your book 60 different times and you're unable to determine whether it's a good book or not, because that actually happens, you get to the point where you read it too much and you can't actually assess whether the writing or the flow of the book is good, you can still use these structures. You can still use the 5-act structure to see whether, at the very least, it's hitting certain points and it's flowing in that specific way. So you can use it as a tool. You don't necessarily have to plot it using this, but it can still help refine your writing. If you enjoyed this, you're probably wondering how you can support me. Well, you can actually do 2 simple things. Follow the first link below to grab a copy of my book, and then follow the second link and sign up for my newsletter. It's that simple. Those 2 things will mean the world to me and give me more time to write books and create content for you. As always, my name is Daniel Poppie, and this is How to Write Good.